My name is Jerm. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas.
I have a PhD in chemistry and undergraduate degrees in biology and chemistry. And I worked in the pharmaceutical biotech field for about 20 years. And I was one of two brand new PhD chemists that Abbott Laboratories hired in 1978 to set up the chemistry group in the diagnostics division. We did that. I left in 1980. I left Abbott to start my first biotech company in California. Moved to Enzyme Systems Products. Had that for about 10 years. Spun it off into, I think it was Prototech. I can't remember all the names now. And then eventually, I left the pharmaceutical industry for good in 1996. And it had to do primarily with what I had seen when I first started at Abbott. One of the vice presidents in a room full of maybe 50 new PhDs or whatever was saying he was thinking about not running an FDA clinical trial for one of the things they were going to market. And he said that right in this room full of all of us. And one of the other executives said, John, I don't know what the guy's name, but let's say it was John. He said, John, now we can't do that, because he knew that he shouldn't have been saying that to the audience, all right? So that struck me immediately, obviously, to see that interaction. But then I just left it alone. I only remembered it years later when I saw other things similar like that and experienced what was going on. And then what really changed me was in the 1980s, mid-1980s, with the AIDS stuff. And because I just moved to San Francisco in 1980, San Francisco Bay Area. Of course, that's when the AIDS thing started happening, but it wasn't called that. It was called GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency at the time. And what a lot of people don't know, and I only learned about it later, working before I met with Peter, though, digging into this AIDS stuff, is that the CDC actually knew as early as 1982 that GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, which later was changed to AIDS, was the use of chronic use of recreational drugs among gay men in the nightclubs, the amyl and butyl nitrites. And those are carcinogenic chemicals. I wouldn't open a bottle of that stuff outside of a fume hood. And these guys had it in the atmosphere in their nightclubs, and you could see it was like cigarette smoke. You see videos of it, of that. So people should not be surprised that they had these horrible things happen to them. And so that was that. And then
wait, hold on. So that drug, are you referring to poppers?
Yeah, poppers. I use the chemical names. Sorry about that. Amyl and butyl nitrite were the poppers, And the CDC understood this as early as 1982. But I didn't learn about that until the later 80s, because I didn't know all this shenanigans and things that were going on. Then in 1984, April 23rd, 1984, the world changed. Margaret Heckler, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, called Robert Gallo out there that he had discovered the probable cause of AIDS. It was one of his HTLV viruses. He called it HTLV3. Later it was changed to HIV. And I didn't know it at that time. I assumed, okay, there's a lot going on here. So I'm a chemist. Aha, a retrovirus, this thing. And I knew viruses, they have all these different genes, and almost all of them have a protease, and I was expert on proteases. So I wanted to know what kind of protease these retroviruses have. There's spiral protease. So that I had worked on spiral proteases up to that point, but I immediately wanted to start designing inhibitors for a spiral protease to cure AIDS. This was 1984. That's what went through my mind as a young chemist with my own company and everything. And but it was probably 3 or 4 months when I dropped the whole effort, because I knew that Abbott had been working on a spiral protease inhibitors for some years. And there's no way I could catch up with that with my small little company and them. They probably already had some on the shelf that they would probably be trying. And oddly enough, I met up with one of the guys at Abbott in the early 1990s. I asked him, how many aspartyl protease inhibitors did you have in 2024? He said 3,000. I was estimating 2. So you see, it was a smart move on my part to drop that entirely. But I still went along with it, and with the whole thing. And one of the things, another thing that really struck me profoundly was, I think it was 84, 85, it was 1985, when we learned about this contagious disease, the virus is causing it and everything. And then it was very clear, it had been going on for several years. And here it was in the Bay Area, and AIDS was in the gay community primarily, It didn't cross the street in the Castro district. And the gay men got Kaposi sarcoma, and the heterosexual didn't get Kaposi sarcoma. They had other things. And so, and women didn't get it at all, and so 9 out of 10 AIDS cases were male. Here we've had this supposedly sexually transmitted contagious thing going on for 6 years, and it was not behaving like a transmissible disease. That was the thing. It was not behaving like a transmissible disease. And so I brought this up once a month. A group of us, academics, industrial people, biotech people, pharmaceutical people like Genentech and my little company and others, we'd meet once a month at University of California, San Francisco for a little seminar. And then after that, we would go to the same Chinese restaurant. It was really good every time, where we got together. And that was really why a lot of us went, not for the seminars, they're pretty boring. But then we would get to talk to each other, learn about each other, what we're doing, and set up the occasional collaboration. And I set up a really nice one with a guy who was working with parasites in animals, and from one of those get-togethers. And so it was a nice thing to do. And then I brought like me, we talk, scientists talk a lot, share these things. That's why we went to those meetings. And when I told them that AIDS, I said, it doesn't look like it's a contagious disease. Nobody would talk to me. All these people I'd been talking to for some years, and we would be sharing things. And boy, that struck me that, what's wrong here? And I was able to keep the collaboration with that academic fellow on this one thing that we had already been working on. If we both agreed not to talk about AIDS. That's how I was able to keep a collaboration going, And that was that hit me really hard. So then I went to bookstores, the gay community, the Castro, they have all these bookstores, massive bookstores. Of course, AIDS, they had in the bookstores massive collection of books on AIDS. So I got those, and I read those things, and I was learning about it, and then and in 1987, of course, that's when Peter Duesberg wrote an invited a paper in Cancer Research in 1987. I didn't see it in 87. I saw it probably the year later. And where he was the world's leading authority on retroviruses, and HIV is supposedly a retrovirus. And it was like a legal document, point for point for point for point, how retroviruses in general and HIV in particular cannot cause any disease at all. And Peter Duesberg had been doing this and saying this for years, in the 80s, and he continued doing it in the 90s. And right after that 1987 paper, it was 1987. Yeah, it was 1987 in Cancer Research. He had the Outstanding Investigator Grant. He was a tenured professor. He probably would have gotten a Nobel Prize at some point. But right after that paper, his grants, his government funding was stopped. And he had the Outstanding Investigator Grant. I think you were able to keep it for 7 years without having to renew it or something like that. And so that, was another thing. Now, I didn't know about Peter Duesberg personally until I got to meet him in 1993. I went across the bay. And I got to see him, and Kerry Mullis was there, so he introduced me to Kerry Mullis, the guy that invented polymerase chain reaction. And but then I kept going back to my little companies, and doing my own thing. But I just wanted to meet the guy, and I had my fill of the biotech pharmaceutical industry in 1996, and I just left for good, and went across the bay to join up with Peter. I wanted to help and support him. I thought maybe for 3 or 4 months. Well, we did it for years, almost 2 decades. And I tell you, he died recently in January, unfortunately. And Joan Shenton is making a movie about this. Other people are too. CHD, Children's Health Defense, they're promoting this, telling this story. And so that was when Peter Duesberg and I joined up, and we worked alternately on AIDS and cancer. And it was, I think it was 1997. He had no more funding. He had some individual rich people in the Bay Area who were funding his lab because he couldn't get government funding for it. Not nearly as much money as the government was paying, though. But it kept his lab going. But it would really shrunk down in size. And so Peter finally started. We went to a little coffee shop about a few days, maybe a week before he went to Germany. It was across from the campus, and we were talking about things. I asked Peter, "What are you going to be doing in Germany on a sabbatical?" And then he told me he was going to look into the hypothesis that unbalanced chromosomes cause cancer, because the unbalanced chromosomes called aneuploidy. The connection between aneuploidy and cancer went all the way back to the late 1800s. David Hanselman, who looked at over 10,000 cancer cells with high-quality microscopes in the late 1800s. He took pictures of them. He drew pictures of them. And he was very familiar with the normal cells, and then he looked at the cancer cells. Normal cells of the same type always look the same, and they always have the same chromosomes. And the cancer cells all look different. No 2 cancer cells had the same combination of chromosomes in over 10,000 tumors that he looked at. Cancer cells that he had under the microscope. And that has been confirmed since then. No 2 they're like snowflakes. No, it's like playing a game of chess. There's no 2 people that are really, really good at chess. No 2 chess games have ever been played exactly the same, because the combinations are just so large. So Peter was going, and then there was Theodore Boveri, who knew a lot about cells. He understood. He was an expert at development, like from a fertilized egg going to a person, going to a mouse, going to an amphibian or whatever. He was good at following this progression of things, and he understood chromosomes too. Nobody knew what chromosomes were in those days, other than they hypothesized that they watched the dividing, and they always had equal number that go from when the normal cell divides. They have an equal number of chromosomes going into the 2 new cells, so they had a pretty good idea. They had a hypothesis that the instructions that these cells use are in those chromosomes, but they didn't know about DNA, and they didn't really know about genes in those days. But they did hypothesize it had to do with developing of these eggs. And he did a number of experiments. In fact, if people, I highly recommend your viewers to go to my website, davidrasnick.com. I have 40 years worth of information on there. And if you click at the top on cancer, you can go to the cancer area. We got the AIDS stuff, cancer. And you go to the cancer area, you'll see a picture of David Hanselman. You click on that, you'll get a biography of him. You go to Theodore Boveri, you click on his image, you'll get his 59-page book, which spells out, and he got it right, and it's in plain language. Anybody who understands English can follow this and get it. How the progression of unbalanced chromosomes can explain virtually everything about cancer. Now, this was his hypothesis. And he published this book in 1914, and he died in 1915, unfortunately. And of course, World War I started in 1914. Boveri's death, so he's not around. Then you had the Second World War. So his hypothesis or his theory, frankly, I would call it a theory. We can discuss the difference in those if you want later. And so it never took off. But other people during that time that didn't even know about Boveri, they had witnessed very similar things and came up with their own. 2 or 3 people did, including George Papanicolaou of Pap smear fame. And he didn't come up with a theory, but he came up with a Pap smear, an automated machine to actually diagnose cancer by counting the chromosomes in the tumor cells. It never went anywhere, and that's a real pity because he got it up and working. But so anyway, what really changed things, that long period, the 2 world wars and everything, and then in 1953, Watson and Crick discovered the double helical structure of DNA. And of course, everybody got all excited. I remember even when that came out, even I got excited about, wow, DNA's double helical structure of stuff. And I was not very old in those days. I was just a kid. And but as a chemist, I can understand how other people like me that make molecules, and this are molecules, that they get really excited about it. Boy, now I want to understand this thing. And the genes are in there, and that's where all the information comes from. And they knew that cancer cells were aneuploid. They were not stupid about this. They knew they're aneuploid, but they couldn't understand. They were not thinking about that, how that imbalance in chromosomes would lead to cancer. They were now thinking in terms of molecules and genes because they have the DNA molecule. And from that time on, the pharmaceutical industry, which makes molecules, synthesizes patents molecules, they're patentable. Then from that day to this day, that whole industry is drug-based, synthetic drug-based. And so in order to have a drug for something, they had to have a target for it. So they're saying that these gene products on the DNA, it gets mutated. And the DNA codes for proteins primarily, my little things that I worked with a lot. So if you get a misspelling in the DNA, you make a mutation in the protein, and the protein may function improperly, which can happen. And that was their hypothesis that they took for years. They call it the gene theory or mutation theory of cancer, that there are mutant genes, and that carcinogens are things that mutate genes. That was their hypothesis. And then they just look for the particular genes, and they look for thousands of them. They look through the whole genome. And it turns out for 10 years now, public doesn't know this, but it's in the scientific literature. I keep up with it, obviously. It's easy for me to do. But these gene people have known for 10 years. We've known, a lot of people have known for a lot longer, but I'm talking about the pharmaceutical people and the academics people have known for at least 10 years that gene mutations do not cause cancer. And although they still publish about these gene mutations, all their literature, they put it in there. Believe it or not, they're even looking at chromosomes these days, trying to link the genes in this chromosome are the problem. And the public doesn't know about it. So that's why I wrote this book. One of the reasons that I wrote my book was to tell this long story.
The outsider's advantage.
Say that again?
The outsider's advantage.
Yeah, that's my book. I should be promoting my book, shouldn't I? The Outsider's Advantage, a personal odyssey into the essence of cancer. And I cover this long story all the way through because it's not just about cancer. It's about the industry, our healthcare system, the whole thing, all the way from government funding and control, pharmaceutical company, the trillion-dollar industries of cancer and everything else that they're working on. And they're based on molecules. Like I said, they're easy to do. They're patentable. And so they just keep pushing this, keep pushing it. And of course, with a peer review, if somebody tries to publish a paper that doesn't mention any of the oncogenes, or anything like that, they start talking about chromosomes, they don't get published. And Peter and I are not cited anymore. There was a little over 1,000 publications I looked at recently since about 2000 on cancer, and I looked for that mentioned chromosomes. It mentioned aneuploidy. Many more papers than 1,000 over that period. But the ones that mentioned chromosomes and aneuploidy, I found 2 or 3 that actually cite Peter in me. All right. Now that is normally, here it's considered scientific misconduct not to cite the pertinent literature, but they're still keeping our names out of it, totally out of it. And the other people, that worked on it, they're keeping their names out of it. That's what we're still going through right now. And my book explains that history and why that's still going on to this day. And I wanted the people to know that, and why things aren't going anywhere. I'll give you a chance to ask me some questions. How about that?
Well, you covered a lot of ground, and I kind of want to go back to the AIDS thing, and then we'll return to cancer, because that's where you started.
Yeah.
When you were working in the 80s, Fauci also came into his position of power, didn't he?
Yeah. He was in November of 1987. Fauci was made head of Department of NIAID, National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And his job, I didn't know it at that time, I know it now. He was brought in that position to turn non-infectious diseases and non-infectious diseases and non-diseases into AIDS. That was his job. And he'd been doing that now for 40 years, I guess.
Fraudulent from the start.
Yeah, absolutely from the very beginning, from the 80s until the day he retired and left. All right, he came up with AIDS. AIDS really hooked. I get in the deep nitty gritty on that in a moment. But after that, then he had the first SARS and the MERS, the Zika, the Ebola, and then the second SARS and all that. They're all bogus. They're all fantasy, all fiction. There's no evidence for any of those things. I'll go back to the AIDS thing here really, really quick, because everything that they were doing in AIDS, they did it on steroids, to use a metaphor, for everything that followed from that. What was his name? Bob Gallo, who supposedly discovered the cause of
with Luc Montagnier.
Luc Montagnier. I'll get back to Luc Montagnier. Well, I'll start off with Luc Montagnier. Luc Montagnier had taken some tissues from AIDS patients, but he could not isolate viruses. He was not capable of doing that at the time. Certainly couldn't find any viruses in there. But he knew about Robert Gallo. I mean, the guy who's been working with viruses for a long time. That's his thing. So he sent the tissues from these AIDS patients to Robert Gallo to see if he could find a virus in there. Well, he didn't. He did not find a virus in there. In fact, I got the literature on this stuff. So he couldn't find any virus. So what he did was he used the same techniques that he used for his other HTLV, his HTLV1, HTLV2. There were retroviruses that he came up with in his laboratory. And he used laboratory techniques to make these sort of pseudo-viruses, And so he did the same thing with Luc Montagnier's sample. He could not culture any virus out of there. So he took a sample of that tissue and he gave him, and then he separated the cells and cultured the cells, and he stressed the cells like he did with his HTLV1 and HTLV2, such the cells started getting really toxic, and they were just trying to survive. And then they would produce these little molecules, these little organelles, they call them exosomes, that leave the cells. And they look like viruses. They have the same little structure, and they have the same dimensions and everything. And all of his HTLVs were bogus. He did them all the same way. And so he took that, did the same thing with Montagnier's cells, and made these exosomes that eventually was called, he called it HTLV3, because he did it the exact same way that he got the other ones with. But then they changed the name to HIV for human immunodeficiency virus, And he didn't attribute any of this to Luc Montagnier. See? And then Luc Montagnier knew what was going on, so there was this big legal battle, and I don't want to get into all those discussions between the two. Luc Montagnier eventually prevailed, and Robert Gallo was tried. It wasn't like a legal trial, but sort of like an academic trial through the NIH, something like that. I don't know the details. And he was found guilty of scientific misconduct, lying, and all that kind of stuff. All right. But the government could not allow him to be found guilty. So they were going to retry him. And you can figure out what was going to go there. The people that found him guilty were not going to retry him. They realized the government's just going to come back in and do the same thing. But it was public knowledge that he'd been found guilty the first time around. So they couldn't have the guy who discovered HIV being convicted of something, and lied and all that. So they had to get him totally out of the picture. So they moved him out of the NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and had him in a comfortable, nice little big place where he was not involved in the government anymore, and he just stayed over there. And he basically was invisible. Like that's how the government does everything. They take stuff they don't want the public to know and make it invisible. Whether it's scientific understandings, whether it's people that are doing wrong things. And, it was recently, though, decades later, then it became very, very public. Luc Montagnier was won, ultimately. All right. And now I'm going off on these tangents. Where would you like me to go with this?
Well, just before we go any further, because you know that the pushback will come, and that is, this is all based on the assumptions that viruses exist or can be isolated.
Yeah, but the real key here is that I stay away from that general question. I'm very specific. This virus, what's the evidence for that? It turns out there was no polio virus. That was total fraud. It was a toxicological problem that's well documented now. And so I looked into each one. That's what I did. There was no HIV virus. You say there's no SARS-CoV-2 virus. I don't want to say there's no such thing as viruses because, frankly, I don't care. The important thing is the ones that are claimed. What's the evidence for this one and that one? And
I think that's scientific.
That is scientific, and I tell you, I've looked it up. There's no Ebola virus. I did a big deep dive into that. People ask me to look in these things, and the Ebola. I just tell you just a little bit about the really short thing about Ebola. One of the things that was published, it wasn't publicized, but it was documented. They had all these wars going on in the Congo, always fighting in the Congo. And the Congo is rich in resources and have lots of gold mines and stuff like that. So I don't know which faction it was, but one of them won and chased off the other people in this gold mine, which was closed. I mean, nobody's working there because of the war. And because it's a gold mine, some of these guys, the warriors, went into the mine to get some gold if they could get it, And the problem with it turns out is that gold is chemically non-reactive. So a lot of the things they use to separate gold from all the other stuff to clean it out down there, it's used all of these very, very toxic and corrosive chemicals that just dissolve everything and leaves the gold. So you can find it. Unfortunately, those things are very, very toxic. And these guys, just by inhaling it or whatever, and they came out of the gold mine, and these guys got sick and died really fast. But only the guys that went down into the gold mine, you see. And that's just and I looked at that, and all of the other so-called, like the swine flu and all these other sorts of things, most of them, they started like in Africa or some other place where Americans don't care about, and nobody digs down and looks into it, in the United States. Other people do. That's why I know about it. The people publish this stuff, but you got to dig down into it and find it.
So, David, okay, so going back to HIV in the late 80s when it was, so to speak, quote unquote, discovered amongst the gay community. At the same time, poor Black Africans were being labeled as HIV positive.
Oh, Lord. I mean, they were just, it was all a fraud. Everything was a fraud. The chemicals. Let me go back first of all with sexual stuff, because the stuff that I have can easily explain. Let me start with that. The easy stuff is they took 30 some odd, nearly 30 diseases and non-diseases before AIDS. And then if you were HIV positive, they changed the definition of those things and they became AIDS, you see, by definition. That's what Fauci had been doing his whole 40 years. You take something like the flu. The symptoms of the flu and COVID-19 are identical on the CDC's website. Guess what? There was no flu cases in 2020 in the United States. You know? And Fauci did that his whole career. He would take these things, you know, and they keep adding, and women refused to get AIDS. So in 1993, I believe it was, the CDC added cervical cancer to the AIDS-defining diseases if you're HIV positive, all right? But as late as 1997, only 1% of the AIDS cases were cervical cancer. So they've been playing this game for decades. And
TB is a big one in Africa.
Yeah, TB, that's right. Africa, I looked at, and I've published this, and I think I put it in my book even. It's all around. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I did have it in my book. You know, they claimed AIDS came from Africa, you know, and they made all these lies about how many people, like when Thabo Mbeki was president, that died under his presidency from AIDS and everything. And I have documented the increase, the massive population increase during the whole period of AIDS and after AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, I mean, they went from double the population of the United States. That's how many, you know, like sub-Saharan Africa. They went over to a billion. Now there's over 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, and there were roughly around, I forget what it was, around the population of the United States. And South Africa was lower, of course, that particular state, country. And it was a population explosion, like 3% or something like that. You know, there was no population decline. It was a massive explosion. Everything they said about AIDS and all the other things that were going on in Africa, they had this. You cannot have these population explosions going on if all these other things are true.
Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is that they were just labeling various illnesses as AIDS.
Yes, absolutely. And people don't know this. It's also in my book. There are two different definitions of AIDS. One for the industrial part of the world, where HIV is part of the definition, and they have like 30-some-odd diseases that the Westerners get. If you're HIV positive, you're AIDS. In Africa, HIV is not even part of the definition of AIDS. It's fever, diarrhea, persistent cough, weight loss, and TB. Those are the diseases of poverty and malnutrition. You know, they're the standard things that always happen to the people down there. So, they've relabeled it. Just like Fauci relabeled the Western diseases as AIDS. Well, the World Health Organization met in Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic, in 1985, I think it was. They came up with the definition of AIDS in Africa, and it was those diseases of poverty and malnutrition. And they had to have an AIDS epidemic in Africa because that's where the United States said it came from. That's why they had to, in 1985, they had to come up with that definition really, really quick. And but you see, because it's Africa, and Americans don't pay any attention, you can lie all you want to about Africa. I bet you most everything that is in mainstream media about Africa is a lie. That'd be my guess. Because everything they talk about diseases is a lie.
So this matters to me, though, because I live in South Africa. South Africa was pretty much the epicenter of AIDS internationally. And you have a history also with South Africa and former President Thabo Mbeki, who was removed because of his position on HIV/AIDS.
That's right. And I was one of the members of this AIDS advisory panel. I think it was 2001.
Yeah, I've actually got the AIDS report, in which, by the way, I think on page 15, it recommends against PCR tests.
Yes, I know. My cat's bugging me. She wants to be part of this conversation.
And that was in 2001.
Yeah, I know. And, and they had all these campaigns. It was Treatment Action Campaign, TAC, was well funded by probably, by a lot of different people, and they were anti-Mbeki. And I put that in my book, too, about what was going on there. And, there's so many crazy things. And there was this huge political push. I guarantee you, the United States was funding a lot of this stuff and trying to keep this thing going and try and put pressure on Thabo Mbeki, because they destroyed his AIDS advisory panel. He went there, had 2/3 of the panel were mainstream AIDS people, and then 1/3 were critics, and like me, Peter Duesberg, and other people. And they never allowed it to happen. We could not have a discussion. I put this in my book too, where it was a 3-day meeting, and we were just about ready to get this thing started when 3 black Americans, very dark black. Southern Africa is sort of a brown, not a black, but 3 very dark black Americans, all dressed the same, very dark suits, came in, no names, no nothing. They sat down, and the whole thing almost came tumbling down at that point, because the people, like the critics of Becky's people, the government wanted to know who these people were, and so they toned it down, because eventually somebody from Becky's office was sent down there and said that these guys, the government, president, United States, asked that these guys be there to observe. My personal feeling is that these very big guys and somber guys with no ID, no name tags or anything, I think they were meant there to be a very big sign of keep your mouth shut, because that's exactly what happened. And especially the mainstreamers, because they knew they couldn't keep us shut, our mouth shut, the critics of what was going on. And so that we started to go, Peter Duesberg was going to give the very first presentation, and one of the mainstreamers on the panel said, no presentation of data. Can you believe that? Now the American public doesn't know this. If they'd have seen that, and in fact, that one of the local television stations had permission, they wanted to present this live to the people of South Africa. And the president said, fine. The government said, fine. The mainstreamer said, no, can't do this. So
I've actually got a video portion from that event, and you can see it's a complete shambles.
Yeah. There were some. The government was themselves were videoing the whole thing the whole time. In fact, we were told, the panelist members were told that one day that was going to be made available to the people of South Africa. Of course, that has not happened.
What you're arguing and have argued is that HIV does not cause AIDS. And even if HIV did exist, it doesn't cause AIDS, because AIDS is just a collection of illnesses, and there's no collective agreement internationally on what it even means.
It doesn't behave like a contagious infectious disease at all. I'm getting to that. But let me tell you this. All you have to do, and I have them, the package inserts that come with all the HIV tests, SARS, and all that other stuff, all the way down, that it says there, for example, the antibody test, HIV antibody test, also the PCR. But the HIV antibody test, they go in there, this big, long package insert that comes with it, and you go down there and you look at the particulars so that you can see how effective it is and everything. And they say specifically in there, they had no authentic reference sample of HIV to validate the test. That's not an exact quote. I don't remember the exact quote, but that's what they say. And I have it. I use it in a lot of presentations and even legal cases, show it to people. And we won a number of cases just by showing the package inserts that come with the HIV antibody test. And it says they had no way to validate the test, they had no HIV to compare the test against, that they assumed, they used the word assume, that 100% of the people who were positive were infected with HIV. And if they were looking for HIV, they were looking for your antibodies that react, that stick to HIV. All right. That happens a lot. And I can even go, that's even titrated. That's even made to produce a certain number of HIV positive people. So they had no way to validate any positive result, which also means they had no way to validate a negative result. But with the positive of people, they assumed that these people that were positive, they were assumed all 100% of them that had the disease were infected. All right. And they had something like 99 point something false negative. And that was, I forget how they did that. They had no way to validate it, but I think they had some, I can't remember what it was, but it's in the package insert. Anyway, they had no way to validate the test. They had no way to do that with the PCR. They had no way to do that with the SARS, the MERS, the Zika, the Ebola, or the SARS-CoV-2. And it says so in the CDC on their website to this day, says there was no, I forget the words they use, no SARS-CoV, SARS, no, not, what's it called, the virus itself. Not SARS-CoV-2. Yeah, I guess it was it. Anyway, there was no virus available for them to validate their antibody test.
So what are they using? They're just making it up.
Making it up. In fact, I tell you about these tests. The test, and I was in the pharmaceutical industry in the diagnostics division, so I understand their procedure. Normally, when you take a patient sample, you want to keep it as concentrated as possible. In other words, you don't want to dilute out any poison or pathogen or whatever like that, bacteria or anything. And so you take a sample, either use it neat, like a swab from your mouth, or if you have to put it like in a dish, you just dilute it with buffer or something, just a small amount before you actually do the test, so that you can make sure you find this thing. Well, the package inserts direct you have to dilute the blood sample 400-fold before you do the test. Typically, it's like 2-fold, maybe 4-fold, but it's 400-fold. All right. Now, and I think this was a titration. What I mean by titration, you set the rules based on what the outcome you want to get. Why was it 400, not 200 or 300? So they wanted to know, and all you got to do is look at my website. I have it on my website under AIDS. That the number, infectious diseases come up really fast, like a flu or something, and then go down in months. That's how they always do. They come up, they go away. Come up, they go away. Well, for the 20, 30 years, I stopped looking after 20 years, I think. The government numbers of AIDS patients, people living with HIV, put it this way, people living with HIV in the United States, was 1 million, plus or minus 100,000. I have a little graph of it on my website under AIDS. All right. There's no infectious disease in the world that does that. It stays constant like that. But AIDS does. That 1 million number has been constant since 1984 or 85. And it goes up a little bit, goes down a little bit.
But
right?
Hold on, can't they use a counter argument and say yes, but it's because of ARVs?
ARVs, antiretroviral? No, it should go down. If it was going to do it, if any therapy was working, it should go down. It's just stayed constant. It has nothing to do with the therapies. It has to do with the test, you see. So my hypothesis was that's where that 400-fold thing came from. And that's still in there, to do it. So that maintains this constant number. If you're going to do that, the other thing is, like Asians have the lowest, it's a racial thing. Asians have the lowest antibody level, constant antibody level for HIV. Africans, black Africans have the highest, and Westerners are sort of intermediate in there.
But isn't it interesting, sorry for interrupting, that former South African President Thabo Mbeki said that AIDS is a disease of poverty?
Yes, but You want to get into that right now?
Not really, no.
It's not really a disease of poverty. I mean, yeah, he was a president, and he saw poverty, and he saw the sick people. You know, he attached the word AIDS to it. Remember, these people are sick. They're the ones that get the AIDS-defining diseases in Africa. Fever, diarrhea, persistent cough, weight loss, and TB. Those are the poor people. All right. So in a way, if you're changing the name of those diseases to AIDS, it is a disease of poverty. But I mean, you play these games, you go back and forth.
I mentioned ARVs. ARVs, if I remember correctly, started out
antiretroviral drugs for people.
Yes, they started out as a cancer therapy, a chemotherapy in the 1980s. So there's an interesting link to cancer.
Yes. So AZT was the first one.
And that was given to Freddie Mercury.
Freddie Mercury. Yeah,
he was given. Yeah, he was the singer of Queen who supposedly died of AIDS. But Judy Mikovits argues that he died of AZT. He was given 1,500 milligrams per day.
Yeah. Oh Lord, that's horrible. Yeah. John Lauritsen, he's a journalist. He's no longer with us anymore. He told me personally, and he's written about this too. But he told me personally, AZT in the late 80s, early 90s killed 330,000 gay men in the United States. And it's still AZT. Let me go into the AZT story. Azithromycin. It has lots of other different names. It was developed in the 1960s as a chemotherapy for cancer. It's very, very toxic. It's so toxic that they never even bothered to patent it. Now think about that. Pharmaceutical company guys developing things, they patent everything. It was so toxic they didn't even patent it. That's why they could use it. It was not patented. But they wanted, for cancer, but they eventually, I think, they did patent it for AIDS. And the bottle of it, Peter Duesberg ordered a bottle of AZT, and he showed me the label, and I even have it on my website. That if you're a scientist, a researcher, and you get a bottle of it, comes with skull and crossbones on the label, And if you use it, go see if you get contact with it, go see a doctor or something, take care of it real quick. And they tell the problems that it could cause. Skull and crossbones. They didn't put that on the AZT bottle they gave these HIV positive gay guys or HIV negative. No, and they killed, like I say, over hundreds of thousands. And who knows if it's in the millions? I have no idea. What the other things do? That's just one drug, AZT. Yeah. So I don't know what else to say about AZT other than they knew it was lethal.
Cancer. You were making the point earlier that then it's not genetic.
No.
Does that mean it's metabolic or environmental?
Oh, so what causes it? Carcinogens. That's an easy word to say. But what are carcinogens? Think about asbestos, a lot of chemicals that cigarette smoke. These are things, and what do? These carcinogens disrupt the separation of the DNA during cell division, the chromosomes during cell division. Every carcinogen that has ever been evaluated as a carcinogen blocks the balanced separation of chromosomes, and that's what gets it started. It could be X-rays. When you have an X-ray, every time you get an X-ray, you're disrupting the cells in your body. That screws up the separation of chromosomes. All carcinogens screw up with the balanced separation of chromosomes. And that's how all cancers start. They all start with unbalanced number of chromosomes.
But then how do you explain what appears to be genetic cancer, let's say breast cancer, and they'll say, well, my mother had it and therefore the daughter's likely to have it?
Yeah, well, you can do this about anything. If you have a family of smokers, that smoke cigarettes, and you can say, okay, it was your family, must have been the food you were eating, it must have been the air you were breathing, but they don't really say, what about the cigarettes you were smoking, or what about the glyphosate that you're working with, and also it's the region. You can make all these associations, but they don't prove anything. They're just a start, a hypothesis to look into. And when you look into it, really dig into it, it's not, and people really, really looked into it. The gene mutation people have now for decades, and they have not found a single gene mutation, not one. I've got this quoted, and the people in the industry are open about it now for 10 years. There's no such thing as a cancer-causing gene. They haven't found any.
So I had the pleasure of interviewing Thomas Seyfried, and he argues something similar to you. He says that it's not genetic. He says that it's metabolic, and that a ketogenic diet, for example, is quite helpful in reduce. Is it? Do you agree with that?
Yeah. The thing the only disagreement, and I've never even really talked to him, but just some people that were bringing up his point of view. Everything he says about that, the whole thing about cancer and the glycolysis business and all that, which I totally agree with, it was Otto Warburg recognized and published on what's now called the Warburg effect. I think it was 1936 or something like that, where he noticed that the normal energy source of cells, of cancer cells, are not like normal healthy cells in humans. In fact, the cancer cells shut down the mitochondria. They're the energy producing factories in our cells. All right. We also have an ancient fermentation source in our body too. It's called glycolysis. And glycolysis is what bacteria and other organisms do. If you want to convert sugar into wine or beer or something like that, or whiskey, you have glycolysis that turns that glucose into ethanol. Well, the glycolysis, we also have that capacity in our body. And the cancer cells rely on glycolysis to turn glucose into energy, ATP, we call it ATP. And it's 200 times faster. The glycolysis is 200 times faster than the mitochondria. Mitochondria are much more efficient. You get a much bigger bang for your buck than you do with glycolysis. But glycolysis is like a fire hose. It just puts it out there really, really fast. All right? And now we're getting to the point where I disagree with Seyfried. That when it talks about aneuploidy, see, my big thing is all cancer cells are aneuploidy. All cancer cells. Aneuploidy is what causes every aspect, including glycolysis.
Which is that imbalance.
Yes. And Seyfried, I don't know if Seyfried himself, because I haven't communicated with him, but people that know him personally, and worked with him, says that the glycolysis is what causes the aneuploidy. Now, I don't know that Seyfried himself says that, but I had a couple of debates with people on that. And if that were true, then what comes first, you see? That's all you got to do is look at the earliest stages of cancer and see what comes first. The earliest thing in all cancers and precancers is aneuploidy, no exception, all right? Not glycolysis. Glycolysis is a result of aneuploidy. And it's very, very simple once you see it. The cancer cells, typical cancer cells, have 70% more DNA, 70% on average. It's a range in there, 70% more DNA. Because they have 70% more chromosomes than normal cells, which is the DNA. And the relative proportions of the DNA to RNA to protein in a cell are constant. In other words, if you double the amount of DNA in your cell, you double the amount of RNA in your cell, you double the amount of protein. Now, you have a nucleus that Papanicolaou was using to look at. He was looking with a light microscope. You could see large nucleuses of cancer cells are much larger than normal cells, and they're abnormal looking. And that's because they have so many extra chromosomes in there. And the cell as a whole, the cancer cell as a whole, is shrinking as a whole, but the nucleus is getting bigger and bigger. And the mitochondria are the next largest thing compared to the nucleus. So they can come and go at will, and they do it all the time in healthy cells. The mitochondria can reproduce, and they can go away. And they go away in cancer cells to make room for all the extra stuff. The protein, the chromosomes, is getting very, very crowded in there. And so but the cell has to have energy. So they can't rely on the mitochondria because the mitochondria can't work in such a small area. They can't even survive. So they rely on glycolysis, which is 200 times faster, you see. So it's the aneuploidy that is the cause of the glycolysis. It needs a source of energy. There's no room for the mitochondria. That's why the mitochondria shrivel and start leaving in the cancer cells. And then glycolysis it just goes up really, really fast. And glycolysis is the Achilles heel of all cancer that I'm aware of. Certainly all solid tumors. I haven't looked into it for the blood cancers, but probably true there too.
But it is a good idea. So it is a good idea, though, to keep your sugar intake low.
Yes. Right. Certainly glucose has an absolute requirement for glucose. And that is the Achilles heel of all cancer, all right? And that's what those things like ivermectin, fenbendazole, some of these other things. Cancer has so many Achilles heels that glycolysis is one of the biggest ones, And they've known this for a long, long time since Otto Warburg. But it's easy to deal with. You can do it with these very inexpensive drugs. And so that's basically it, So large number of chromosomes is what makes all the difference.
How effective is chemotherapy?
Oh, it's very effective at killing people. It's the 6th leading cause of cancer. So it's very effective at those things. It has no therapeutic effect at all, benefit at all. It should all stop immediately. All chemotherapy and radiation, they're totally lethal. They're harmful, they have no beneficial effects what all, zero. All right? And that's a very good reason to keep me shut up, and to keep the other people who want to,
But you know that the counter response is, but David, I know somebody who went through chemotherapy and their cancer went into remission.
Yeah, for how long? How long? How long was the remission? Okay, let me give you the numbers. The current numbers, and they're going down, of people, the 5-year survival rate, which they keep every year. You can get the data. The 5-year survival rate on chemotherapy, of people taking chemotherapy, the standard treatments, is 2 to 3% for 5 years. 2 to 3%. All right. Coley's toxin, which I haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about William Coley a little bit if you want to, and these other non-toxic things. But Coley's toxin has his daughter. He went around. I'll tell the details about what it is in a moment. I'll just tell the story. He was using this now for years. He's an oncologist in New York. He was a physician. And he had been treating, and other people had been using what are called Coley toxins or mixed bacterial toxins over the decades. His daughter compiled the data from all over the world. People are using his method. And the 5-year survival rate of people taking Coley's toxin, cancer patients, is 50%. Not 2%, not 3%, 50%. All right? And the only way that I've been able to find the use of Coley's toxin in the United States is if people are simultaneously taking chemotherapy. But if you go to Europe, if you go to Mexico, they use these non-toxic therapies for people. And it's becoming more popular now. I mean, now the glycolysis thing now is all the rage. Thank goodness, finally, it's getting out there. Mm. It's been known since 1936.
David, this is actually a topic that's way bigger than 1 hour, and time is now against us. I'm wondering if you'd be so kind as to return for a second conversation so we can unpack some of this even more.
I'd be happy to. I know it's a long story. Each one of these stories is a long story.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, okay. All right. Fantastic. Okay. So then for now, how can my audience follow your work?
You can go to my website. It's davidrasnick.com. Has 40 years worth of information on there. And I keep it updated on a regular basis. Some of my books, you can download them from their papers. I've got various different links, like to cancer and to AIDS, and I got tons and tons of information and data. It just keeps going deeper and deeper as you click on these icons. And so you can learn about William Coley, Peter Duesberg, the AIDS stuff, the cancer, all the tests on HIV, those things I was telling you about, the information I've got on there about how bogus they are, and lots and lots of stuff. Lots of videos. I've been doing tons of these things even before my book came out, but now it's exhausting me, but I'm not complaining.
All right. Well, on that note, David Rasnick, thank you for joining me in the trenches.